All right, so just like what we saw in the last section around series, data frames can have index values similarly as well. So if we take a look at our carrier or our airline's data frame, which you see in the slide here, we can also see that in my notebook over here. We can see that we do have index values, right? Right now, the index values on the far left, you always notice the index values based off of, they're bold compared to the other column values are not bold. So far left, we see we have values 0 to 15. Those are our index values. Now, one thing to realize is that when we take a look at what our index values is, just like what we saw with the series, we'll by default almost always get this range index. This just means that it's a numeric range starting at 0 and it stops but does not include 16, right? And that's just what we see here, 0 up to 15. Now, when we load a data frame using the pandas read CSV function, then almost always the default index is going to be 0 to n-1, where n is the number of rows in the data frame. Okay, and this is often called or referred to as the range index. Right. So for the most part, when you import data, you're going to end up having a situation like this where you have however many columns, but your index values will be 0 to however many rows minus 1. Now, we can always access an individual row in a data frame by using this .loc accessor. And we saw this a couple times up to now. And we haven't really talked much about it, but .loc, it's an accessor. And an accessor is a little bit unique from a function. It is an attribute designed specifically to help users reference something else, right? And in this case, we are trying to reference a row in a data frame, right? So if I want to get the 5th row, right? Recall that we have basically zero-based indexing going on right here. So the 5th row actually ends up having the index value of 4, right? So to get that, we can just go ahead and say df.loc, and then we have our regular brackets, and we have 4, and that's going to give DL, or Delta Airlines. So we can see that right here. We have DL as a carrier and Delta Airlines. If we wanted to get the 10th row, that would have the index value of 9. We can get that. We see we have MQ, and it's Envoy Air. All right, so as with this series, data frames support reassigning their index, right? We can actually change the index of a data frame. With data frames, we often see people change the index value to be represented by one of the columns that exists in the data frame. Okay, so this is analogous to like a primary key in relational databases, if you've worked with those. So in our case, we could look at our data and we could say, well, we have duplicate information here, but maybe carrier makes sense to have as our key, or excuse me, our index values, right? And so what we could do is we could always set our data frame to have that index. So we can do df.setIndex, and then we pass it the name of the column we want it to have as our index, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say this as df. And now when we look at df, we see that our column here, it looks a little bit differently. It's now been moved over to the far left. It is now in bold. And that's because it now represents our df index. Right? So if we look at our index values, we see these are all the individual values in our index. Right? So why is this useful? Well, what we can actually do is we can use our .loc accessor to reference a certain index value. So if we want to look up, in the example here, it's American Airlines, and the index value or the carrier value for that is AA. So I use that as my value. Oh, and you can see I tried to do brackets here. I tried to do traditional indexing on our data frame, and I got an error. What I meant to do was .loc. Right. So now we see we extract that row, right? and it's just American Airlines. If I want to get U.S. Airways, right, that is represented by U.S. And so let's go ahead and do U.S., and I would get that row, which just has one column, name, and it's U.S. Airways Inc. And we see that here, name, U.S. Airways Inc. Now, okay, we saw this earlier when we were working with series, that we can actually have duplicate values for our index values, okay? And data frames are no different. So we can actually have each row represented by the same index value if we wanted to. Now, this is not preferable, and the problem with that is now we have no way to refer or index to a specific row, right? If we don't have index values that are unique, then that limits how we can actually do some filtering, some indexing, and so on. So we tend to steer away from doing that. But, you know, you may see it in some organizations, and just it's good to realize that if you reassign the index values, you can actually have duplicate values across multiple rows. Okay, so whenever you are changing the index of your data frame, likely you're going to want to end up maybe resetting the index values. And we can do that. So right now we have our data frame here where we have carrier as our index value. But if we wanted to change this back to how it was originally, where we had carrier as a column and we had index values just 0 through 15, we could do so, and we could apply this reset index. Okay, so I could do df.reset index, and that is going to change our index to be the default 0 to however many rows minus 1. And now our original information contained in our index values is now contained as a column itself. All right, so that's it for kind of digging into data frames, getting an understanding of what data frames are made up of, how we do this thing called indexing based off of index values for both series and data frames. Now, in future lessons, we're really going to start working with data frames pretty heavily, and how do we do different things such as manipulating the data frame, how do we do filtering, how do we actually do some summary statistics with our data frame, and so on. So we're really going to get very hands-on with data frames and get familiar with how do we work with them.